Hey guys, Zomfox here, and today we're going to be doing the review of the 2023 XFL regular season review. We've gotten through the entire season already. I know, it felt like just, a couple days ago the XFL was starting up and we were all speculating how it was going to shake down with the USFL, but the regular season is over and we're heading into the playoffs this weekend. So, it's time to look at the season and see exactly how did they do in a lot of different areas in numbers, optics, and overall basically everything. So, without further ado, let's just go right into the overall TV ratings across the season. Now, as you can see here on the left side, the left number is the across the entire season. The right number is through weeks 6 and 10, the weeks that we didn't cover, since last time was mid-season review. And as you can see, the numbers overall are pretty mixed. But overall, I think that the XFL should be looking at as a success. The ABC number is one that is definitely a very weird one. You see, the ABC one, there was only really two games in the first half of the season, and then there was like four or five in the second half of the season. So while yes, it did go down to 904K and was up at 1.09 million, that 1.09 is really helped by the fact that the week one numbers were very solid for ABC. The XFL naturally never got that back to those numbers of 1.5 million people watching the games, but they still had a couple decent games, a couple games that had over a million viewers. So overall, ABC was a success, just like NBC and Fox are for the USFL. The ABC did their job, but it was a fact that there was scarcity on the network, so they didn't have as many lower type of games. Then we have ESPN. ESPN was a bit similar. There wasn't too many games in the first half of the season, yet they ended up having an overall decent-ish numbers. Overall, having 600,000 people watching across the whole season, I think, is a massive W for the league. I think the fact that there wasn't a huge drop off across your season numbers to your week 6 through 10 numbers shows that you overall had a solid attendance. Now, naturally, there were a couple games that had very, very, very poor numbers, especially during weeks 2 through 5. The games that were on ESPN really didn't do too hot. A lot of that was due to March Madness and stuff like that. But the numbers overall were solid for ESPN. And then we get to ESPN2, where I think ESPN2 did a decentish job. The fact is, they have fallen off since their week 2 through 5 highs, but naturally, ESPN2 and FX had less games in the second half of the season than they did the first half of the season. And I think that might have hurt their numbers, as instead of, those channels being your go-to XFL channels, they weren't as much. And so you end up having ESPN2 drop nearly 100,000 people across season versus week 6 through 10. And FX, you had 150,000 drop off from 428K to 275. I think the last couple FX games really did very poor overall, but I think that's not the most surprising considering the fact that they were during March Madness for the most part. But overall, I think when you look at the TV ratings, I think this is where the XFL succeeded the most and probably exceeded their own expectations. The fact is that ESPN and ESPN2 are the ones I look at and say did really well. FX had a couple weeks where they did very well, but ABC, I don't really look at that as a huge success. I look at that as just, doing the minimum. You didn't have a ton of games on ABC, so you had a scarcity. So when you did have games on there and they had nearly a million viewers, they usually weren't competing with literally any other sporting event. So it's not like they really did a ton. It's not like the USFL where there was a game on broadcast like twice a week. This was one where you had two on the first week and then you had one every couple weeks at the end of the season. So I think ABC was a FX was as well, but ESPN and ESPN2, I think overall were very successful. ESPN getting a 600,000 viewers per game across the season as well as through the end, I think is very solid for them. Now, in terms of the competition versus the USFL, there have been 2 weeks so far where the games have or the weeks have overlapped. Week 1 of the USFL season and week 2 against week 9 and 10 of the XFL. Now, the thing is that in terms of how they competed against each other, I've talked about this more in the USFL week reviews. Essentially, both weeks I consider really neither league truly won because mainly it's kind of hard to say. Essentially, USFL won in the week 1 versus XFL week 9 in terms of overall attendance and head-to-head stuff. And then in week 2, the XFL won. But both of them, there wasn't really a reason they shouldn't. Essentially, the XFL had insane luck in terms of what the teams did because back at last year, week 9 of the USFL through week 10, there was one game that mattered. There was the Breakers Bandits game in week 9, which is the only game that mattered across both weeks. Whereas the XFL, across these last 2 weeks, only one game didn't matter, and that was the Roughnecks Renegades, and that was only because the Brahmas lost in the game before. So, 7 of their 8 last games had playoff implications. So, a casual viewer would rather tune in to see a playoff implication game than just an early week game. So, especially in the week 2 aspect, like I talked about in the USFL week review for week 2, While yes, the Gamblers Breakers game on week 2 on USA only had 130,000, which is a terrible number. It's not one where the XFL should feel like they easily won or had a great success, because at the end of the day, they were supposed to beat them. They had a game start 30 minutes earlier, so people are going to tune into theirs instead of the other one. And you had the fact that it was on ESPN versus USA, and the Battlehawks were the home team. They're the biggest drawing crowd in both TV and in terms of attendance. And it was a game that had playoff implications throughout the whole game. So while you look at the numbers, a lot of them can be mixed, but overall, I think that neither company should be viewing it terribly. Both Fox and the ESPN and them, neither group should be feeling bad. I think that both leagues overall did their job in a good sense, especially when you consider the fact that the two USFL games in week 2 on broadcast were two terrible games. It still had the viewers they did compared to the Brahmas Defenders game, which was the second best game of the entire weekend for either league. That does show that there is some good for the USFL in terms of the people watching it. And then the fact is that, I mean, hey, both these leagues, naturally, we don't know exactly how these numbers are going to play out. We're mainly waiting to see what happens once the XFL is done and there's no, overlap, but we'll see. Now, in terms of the big thing for the XFL is the attendance. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The fact is that attendance is the most important thing for the XFL. That was what they basically marketed their whole league about, was the fact that they had, in-person attendance, which naturally the USFL is doing the hub model, so only some teams do. And so in that aspect, the USFL or the XFL basically needed to do good in attendance. And if we're looking at it in an overall sense, they didn't. They kind of failed. Now, get out of the way, the Battlehawks, huge success. The Battlehawks were an incredible success. Their worst games had 33,000 people. Those were their worst games. So the Battlehawks, huge success. There's nothing short to say about that. Then they were incredible. They obliterated all the other teams in total attendance as well as every single week. And they even did over 7,000 people better than the last iteration of the Battlehawks did in their 2 games. So they were a success. The Defenders, kinda. Now, the Defender fan base is incredible, but both due to in part of not having tickets be available all the time, as well as other things, they actually didn't succeed at matching or surpassing the 2020 Defenders. But that one I'll call a wash because the fan base is truly insane in DC, so I'll give them credit there. But once you get past those 2 teams, every other team was either a disappointment or an outright failure. An example of that would be the Dragons and the Brahmas. Essentially, both these teams were expected to get a minimum of 20,000 fans per game. The Seattle Dragons in the 2020 XFL ended up having an average of 25,000 fans per game, as they had 29,000 in week 2 and then 22,000 in week 3. The Dragons in this iteration of the XFL averaged 12,000 fans per game, with their highest being just over 15,000 a couple times. Now, yes, I know some people are going to say, oh, but, they scheduled games at the same time as the Kraken, or, they had games on Thursdays when they shouldn't have. Okay, then that's the XFL's fault. You got to say that. The fact is that the Dragons' attendance was a failure. They were a failure. You dropped over 10,000 fans per game from your last iteration, and the Brahmas are no different. They're also a failure. The San Antonio Commanders of the AAF averaged over 27,000 fans per game and actually did have a 30,000 fan game at one point. Yet this team had one game where they did great, where they had 24,000 in week 1, and it looked like they were going to be great. And then they fell off to 13,000, and then 12,000 is where they kind of plateaued. Essentially, they had that week 1 high, and then they fell off. Now, a lot of people say it's because the team is bad. But, I mean, man, if that's your only excuse, then you're basically saying that if the Battlehawks are bad, people aren't going to show up, which that's not a good sign. So, I don't really take that too much into consideration. And then other teams that failed, the Orlando Guardians, huge failure as well. The fact is that before we knew they were terrible, which was basically like week 4, in week 2 they had 12,000 fans. That was their best game across the whole season. The Orlando Apollos in the AF, which weren't even that great a team, they were just decent, ended up having nearly 20,000 fans per game. So this is bad luck for the Orlando Guardians, especially since they had 3 separate games that couldn't even crack 8,000. And then other teams that were not really failures, but disappointments, would be teams like the Renegades, where, yeah, they're called the Arlington, but Dallas and Arlington are basically the same thing. They dropped 5,000 fans per game. The Roughnecks ended up going from 18,000 fans per game to just under 12,000 fans per game. Another overall disappointment. And Overall, just not great. And then the Vegas Vipers were the new team that hadn't had a city before. Complete disaster. Their field sucked. The fans in attendance was terrible at 6,000 fans per game. Everything about the Vipers was horrid, from their coaching, from basically everything. So yeah. So in terms of attendance, overall, I would say it was a failure. Now the Battlehawks are a huge success, and the Defenders fan base was great. But numbers wise, this was where the XFL was supposed to succeed and completely, stomp everything. Now, yes, the atmospheres are still good, and I'm not going to say, oh, I prefer the USFL having a hub game where no one shows up. But the fact is, this is what the XFL was marketing to, and this is what they failed at. You had one team that was a true success, one that was kind of a success, and then 6 teams that ranged from disappointments to complete failures. So, overall, not the best. And now there's time to look at the couple scandals the league had. The league ended up having a couple scandals across the season, which were really not the best. The first one is Jerseygate. Essentially, Jerseygate was mainly the DC Defenders jerseys, or just overall the jerseys. So the USFL both last year and this year allowed you to pre-order jerseys, and so you knew they were eventually coming. The XFL never let you know they were coming, and then randomly late in the season they said, "Oh, jerseys are here." Then everyone got pissed off because you couldn't buy a replica jersey. Or they call it a replica, but it's really an authentic jersey. So you couldn't buy a replica for like, $100 or $80. You had to buy the authentic for $190. No, you can get a hockey authentic jersey for cheaper than that. So already it was a bad look. Then it got worse because of the fact that the only jerseys you could get were the base 23, like, just like the USFL. Or you could get one jersey that had a name on it, and it was D. Johnson 54, Dwayne Johnson. Essentially, the most egotistical thing you could think of. So already a terrible look for the XFL. And then we had the jerseys come to people's houses who ordered them. Now, 7 of the jerseys, overall solid. Some people complain that the numbers aren't huge or stuff. Overall solid. Then you had the Defenders. I mentioned the Defenders had like the most insane fan base. Well, they got rewarded by getting jerseys that were terrible. The picture on the left is what they were supposed to look like. They were supposed to have, the little stripes and the stars on the collar, on the, collars of the sleeves, as well as, have the numbers be big and bold. And then what you got was you had the numbers down where the stars and stripes are supposed to be. The stripes and stars are nowhere to be found, and the numbers, especially in the back, look insanely small. And then they ended up changing the picture to have the new jersey that people got instead of the one they were advertising, which was, let's just say, a terrible look. This was a horrid look for the XFL, and the fact is that they never really said anything about it. They just ended up changing their picture to, act like nothing had happened, which really pissed off a lot of people. You're going to charge nearly $200 for a jersey. You at least got to do it right, especially since they have the Under Armour license, and they didn't have Under Armour make these. That was a really bad look for the league. And then the other massive bad look was the Quinton Dormady situation. Essentially, Quinton Dormady was a quarterback for the Guardians, and during the season, he got released, and it was because of the fact that he had ended up selling plays to other teams. Come to find out, like a week and a half later, he didn't actually do that. The XFL cut him and made his name bad without doing really any actual research. Found out about that, then reinstated him, acted like nothing was wrong, and just kept going on. That's a bad look for the league. At the end of the day, that's always going to follow him now. Just like whether or not you believe Tom Brady, was responsible for deflating the footballs, that's always going to be in his name. Just like this is going to be always on Dormady's name. You can't get rid of it once you make it public and actually cut him. You're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty, but the league decided to make it guilty until proven innocent, which is a terrible look for them. Now, that's basically all it is for the review of the season. Now, the one thing I will quickly mention, I know a lot of people really aren't a fan of how the playoffs ended up happening. Essentially, what ended up happening is that the Battlehawks and Dragons were competing for the last playoff spot, and the 7-3 Battlehawks missed the playoffs, where the 4-6 Renegades make the playoffs. Honestly, I am okay with that. The reason I'm okay with that is because I think that the division setup for a 2-division 8-team league is fine. I think that you have to have the 2 teams that are top of the division make the playoffs is the right thing to do, because that makes the divisional matchups that much more important. If you get rid of that, it doesn't really make the divisional games that much important. It's just about winning head-to-heads with certain teams. So I'm actually okay with this system being like it is. It's just one of those things where it's a shame that you have the 3 best teams in the league having one of them miss the playoffs, and then you have like the 4th and 5th best team make the playoffs, those being the Roughnecks and Renegades, since I think everyone knows the Battlehawks, Dragons, and Defenders are all better than those 2 teams. But I think that you have to have the system like it is, We see that happen in the NFL as well, where teams miss the playoffs while having a great record, and a team with a bad record makes it. So I'm not really a big deal about it. Now, I will say, I think that for next year, I think The Rock needs to stop being, so involved in literally everything. I think the fact that he's, trying to make everything about him instead of the league is a bad sign. Making the jerseys D Johnson, having your own tequila brand be the sponsor, having like all the off-season ads be basically himself. I would like to see that go away. I think that'd be a massive benefit for the league. But overall, they got through a season. I think it's a success. I think their TV ratings were a massive success that were probably better than a lot of people expected, whereas their attendance was a lot worse than people expected and overall a failure. But it was a mixed bag, just like the USFL season was last year. It was a mixed bag. But overall, this is this has been Zomfox. If you enjoy this content, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. We're doing at least 3 videos per week for this season of the USFL. And as always, have a great night.